Straight up with the Rev, the show that does not hold anything back. And today we're looking at 5 major reasons Africa is poor. Number 4, which is weak institutions. And if you recall, last time we're looking at the 5th of those 5 reasons, which was poor governance. So weak institutions, number 4, and then we count down all the way to number 1. Now, this show is not targeted at any government, party, or ruling class. It is non-partisan, neither is it condemning or endorsing any particular party, group, or affiliation. Now, this looks at the overall factors and how they play a great role in bringing about the effects we see of widespread poverty on the continent of Africa. And one of the seemingly unjust realities that currently dog our continent is the fact that its citizens are very poor. And when I use the term very, I'm not exaggerating. It is very, very true. Now, in a recent study carried out by the Global Finance magazine with data sourced from the IMF, we have the 20 poorest nations in the world, and the 2 pictures that you're going to see or graphs are going to illustrate that. Now, in those graphs, gross domestic product or GDP is based on something called the purchase power parity or PPP per capita. Now, values are expressed in current international dollars to the nearest whole dollar, reflecting the single year's 2016's currency exchange rates and the PPP adjustments. In fact, to be honest, 2019 figures. Now, out of the 20 poorest countries in the world, 15 are located in Africa. 15. Now, another sobering stat is that for every $1 that is spent in aid toward the poor country, $25 is spent servicing debt repayment. Can you believe that? $1 in, 25 out. Unfortunately, poor countries spend 25 times more money paying back debts it cannot afford, whilst basic services are limping to non-existent. And to best illustrate this or understand this, you got to picture a household and use that illustration. In the developed world, a typical household that is struggling financially would normally be paid a weekly check from their welfare system. Now, these amounts paid help toward basic standing expenses, which of course include food, and that could come in the form of food stamps, gas, electricity, and water. Remember, they have to heat up a lot, so they use the gas for both. And then in poor countries, though, poor people, in those countries, people will still own a car, they'll have an iPhone, they'll get the latest clothes, and they'll even subscribe to cable TV. Can you believe that? The car, phone, clothes are bought using available credit through, of course, credit cards and store accounts, and maxed out. So when money comes in, it mostly goes to debt repayments. If you've been following the lessons that we've been doing here, you will realize that these are liability-based expenses. Now, furthermore, the debt repayment far exceeds the income earned, and in short, the expenses are, literally, for lack of a better word, way beyond earning capacity. Now, many African countries are similar. They have large service provision and massive expenditure, which of course would include overheads, huge wage bill, defense, infrastructure development, pending social services, etc., 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 and very small income earnings. And whenever incomes could be earned or are being earned, that income suffers from massive pilferage in the form of corruption at every level, from the grassroots through to the highest institutions. And this particular show deals with the factors that are exacerbating the situation. And if African countries could deal with these problems, most of our poverty would be significantly, and I mean significantly, reduced. Now, the challenging factors. You see, having looked at the full definition of what institutions relate to in context of the African poverty, let us now see what cancers are eating up this vital pillar from the inside. The first cancer, you got it, corruption. You see, it goes without any doubt that corruption is by far the most evil vice that is widespread in most African countries. It is the number 1 cancer destroying institutions from within and from without. It is no wonder that studies have shown repeatedly that corruption and the wealth of a nation are inextricably linked, and in that rich countries conversely have least amount of corruption, whilst poor countries have the most. Can you believe that? And unfortunately, corruption in African countries is at such levels, from the traffic officer to the policeman in the community, the local council market chairperson, the civil servant in key ministries like lands, revenue and customs officers at the tax office, procurement departments in both the public and private sector, school registrars. I mean, it's everywhere. It is this widespread level of corruption that has inevitably eaten wealth like a cancer from within us. Anyone who points to politicians and leaders is inevitably pointing at themselves. See, corruption isn't just about the recipient, it's also both the giver and recipients. Both are perpetuating the disease and exacerbating poverty in three critical ways here in Africa. Firstly, it causes the resources, especially money, that could be collected to help run institutions correctly to be diverted into people's pockets. These render the institutions incapable and can no longer function effectively. This is very common, especially when it comes to fees and penalties. Secondly, it erodes confidence in the said institutions, and if society perceives partially or ineffective oversight by the said institutions, then support dwindles, which in turn nullifies their roles and leaves anarchy in its place. I mean, everyone does what they deem fit in their eyes. Thirdly, or lastly, the general public and service recipients suffer the most. Why? Because the sector is no longer efficiently regulated or monitored. And this in turn disenfranchises the populace and inevitably perpetuates poverty and its effects. Now, I'm going to also mention that hemorrhaging of funds, this is basically where funds end up in wrong hands. Instead of money reaching government for distribution to these critical institutions, it ends up in the hands of few individuals at the detriment of development. And this hemorrhaging is evidenced by gross inequalities throughout society. Basic amenities and services for the masses remain very low to non-existent. Another sad fact is that all money that is stolen, especially that which is in millions of dollars, is siphoned consistently and taken to offshore accounts and investments outside the country, in fact, many times outside the continent. This means that even after stealing that money, it does not even, get used within that nation, but it is taken to the already rich countries to be stored in banks, purchase luxury penthouses and vehicles, and sustain excessive lifestyles, which include education for the kids, first-class education, and lavish holidays. Furthermore, you have the issue of lost revenue. Look, weak imbalanced tax collection, which is normally the case, because then you have a very small tax base. It's not broad. It's focused on, workers that pay, like here in Zambia. And many times this challenge is that because institutions are weak, the tax base is very small. Usually it's targeted at civil servants, private, corporate, formal sector, and organizations. With unemployment standing somewhere between 50 to 90%, God knows what the right figure is, of the population, especially in most African countries, you find that they have a rather large untapped informal sector that would enlarge the government revenue base immensely. However, that sector can never be efficiently taxed. Why? You guessed it, weak institutions. Most revenue would end up being lost to even more widespread corruption. So what are the consequences? Okay, subsequent failure to fund critical sectors, of which the four are very critical. And now I'm going to go into these four sectors and really break it down. All right, so don't go away. You come back, we'll pick it up. Right, so the first of the four sectors is the transport sector. Now remember that this sector is the lifeblood of commerce and industry. Without a good transport sector, moving of goods and services becomes very expensive. And this in turn hampers development and growth in the economy. In fact, if transport and roads are not well developed, many areas would remain cut off and inaccessible, preventing development and growth and thus subsequently perpetuating poverty. In Zambia, for instance, key institutions that govern this sector include but are not limited to mainly the Road Development Agency and, of course, the Road Transport and Safety Agency. And also in the construction industry, you've got the National Council for Construction, which plays a critical role in ensuring that right standards are maintained. The assurance of the maintenance of these institutions is directly proportional to their independence from the executive. And this is true of rich countries. In most African countries, these sectors have much work to do in terms of developing and reaching truly independent status. So I can say this, in Zambia, we're really privileged because we're now at a point where that these three sectors are working quite hard. Obviously, there's much left to be desired, but overall, there is work being done. I think a lot of people will appreciate the amount of work that has been going on as far as the road development in the country is concerned. Now, others may have issues to say about that, but I think this is definitely a step in the right direction because that will help alleviate poverty in a country like this one. And you can see countries like Botswana, countries like Namibia have got great road networks, and these really make a difference when it comes to the movement of goods and services around. The second sector is the police. Now, these are the first step in enforcing and upholding the rule of law. This institution is very critical to ensure no anarchy prevails. A well-funded police service safeguards peace and harmony and guarantees justice for all. Where people choose to break the law, there is recourse to justice in transparent and professional manner. Unfortunately, in most poor countries in Africa, the police services are very corrupt. This therefore means that those with money get favors and never suffer consequences for breaking the law. In countries where corruption is widespread, criminals walk scot-free without any fear. This then sees injustice prevail, the poor unjustly suffering, and gross unfair incarceration of the innocent simply because they do not have the means nor the resources to pay arresting officers in order to lose files or pay lawyers for the proper legal representation where cases go to court. The saddest part of this all is that when institutions like the police and the judiciary are weak or riddled with corruption, innocent people, and I stress that, innocent people get sentenced to long prison terms besides the absolute disregard of habeas corpus. I know people that have been in detention for years simply because no one on the outside could get their files to court to expedite the case. I'm not talking about anything like paying anybody. Just get that file from wherever to get it to court. And in extreme cases, have even been executed while guilty criminals and murderers walk free. This will always be the case until the day that this vital institution is properly financed. That can only happen when corruption and siphoning of money ceases at all levels. Now, I gotta speak a little bit more on the police. I gotta say that the police themselves are grossly underpaid, and because they are grossly underpaid, what happens with the police is that they get to a point where they have absolutely no means whatsoever to run their lives, to meet their basic needs, and so therefore they cannot function happily. Just for instance, in most African countries, the police aren't even accommodated. And if they are, it's very, very iffy accommodation. So what that means then is that they are so frustrated about their lives and their well-being that there's absolutely no way they're going to be thinking properly to even execute work when it comes to criminal and any form of criminal arrests. So that's the situation with the police. Currently, many police are recruited, but very few find accommodation to take care of themselves. The pay is very paltry. And now, why you tell me a criminal who's making a lot of money is going to easily bribe a man like that? So these are some of the challenges that we face in the police service. It's a real challenge, and obviously there's a lot more to be done. And you must remember that for most African countries, the wage bill is already way too high. And because it's too high, they can't afford to keep adding more people to it. Which brings me to the third section of education. Now, there are two critical sources of wealth in any nation. The first source lies and is harnessed from the ground, its natural resources such as minerals, water, agricultural produce, all products coming from the ground. The second source is ideas that can be harnessed from the minds of its citizens. Now, these ideas can only be harnessed if the minds of the citizens are empowered and sharpened by correct education. Unfortunately, in most poor countries, education simply does not get to the masses. Most citizens have to walk miles to get to a school. I'm talking tens of miles, or is it, 20s of kilometers. Most times having an unusually large number of pupils to one teacher. Schools have been known to have as many as 90 to 120 pupils per teacher. This is further worsened by the lack of education tools and textbooks. Lastly, prohibitive costs mean that the poorest of the poor can't even access education, which is very, very unfortunate because this is the one source that guarantees their key out of poverty. See, that key is cruelly prohibited because this vital institution is not adequately funded. In very poor countries, the money simply never gets to the sector, period. For those poorly governed, education gets minimal funding. This means for most citizens, their true potential shall never be harnessed, their ideas never developed, their potential never reached, their genius never opened up, their ingenuity never exploited, their skill never tapped, their talent never seen, and worst of all, they never get a chance of being wealthy. It is a fact that all rich countries have invested greatly in their education institutions, whether be it nursery, primary, secondary, tertiary, specialized colleges and universities. This is further enhanced by very advanced research and development funding pools, or what they call R&D. In short, they fund ideas and work to develop them over years. It is through this strategy that quality of life and entrepreneurship blossoms. Why? Because ideas are always being exploited. Furthermore, wealth increases when innovation, in which sectors? Social, political, environmental, and technological, are encouraged, fostered, and rewarded. Unfortunately, for many African countries, the aforementioned does not happen, and so very few who manage to get the education end up heading for greener pastures abroad. The same rich countries, to work and develop their economies. So that literally robs the poor countries of the very scarce human resource to start with, further prolonging poverty. Which then brings me to the fourth sector, which is very heartbreaking, the health sector. This is where the greatest tragedy for me lies. As the saying goes, a healthy nation is a wealthy nation. If the citizenry cannot access basic medical care for easily treatable and preventable diseases, then we see more people die early and never get a chance to fully realize their potential. With an average life expectancy of between 30 to 50 years, it means most of the population dies without truly reaching their full potential. Now, according to a presentation made by Peter A. Singer on TED, there is a formula or recipe for keeping a country poor, and herein I am going to speak three of those that relate to health and have dire consequences for the population. Now, unfortunately for most African countries, this is true. So the first one is the high death rate for women and children. The second one, impeding the cognitive development of children that survive. And the third one, leaving mental illness untreated and stigmatized. You see, this is perhaps another area that leaves much to be desired. In fact, I'll really focus on the mental illness. You have to understand that because mental illness is stigmatized, grossly underfunded, and ignored, this means that these three areas see massive deaths. Think about it this way. First of all, many children die young. Mothers die young. Why? Because the necessary, aids that are going to help them to give birth safely aren't there. Zambia, my country here, Zambia still has a relatively high mortality death rate. That's infant mortality rate. And that's not good at all. Because for every one of those children that are dying, potentially that's a mind loss. That's a leader loss. That's somebody that could have come to make a massive difference in this great nation of Zambia. You must also remember that for those that go on to be born, they have the massive challenge of dealing with those first 5 years. Now, Zambia has taken massive strides to work towards under five clinics and under five care for children. But you must recall that this is just in these urban areas. The rural areas are terribly challenged. You've got health posts that are almost 50, 60 kilometers away from quote-unquote civilization. And now the challenge is that many of these essential drugs and implements that should be used in such places don't get there. So you have to realize that then this increases the likelihood of children dying from very preventable diseases. And you know what that does? That robs our nation of another great genius that could have become somebody. You have to understand that these things, including mental illness, in fact, for me, mental illness takes a close part. There is a great chance and robbery of human resource. There are many forms of mental illness that can be treated, and those that suffer from many forms can be treated and reintegrated into society to become major contributors. And many forms of autism, bipolar disorder, cerebral palsy, motor neuron degenerative diseases, like what, for example, the late Professor Stephen Hawking, the famous theoretical physicist, suffered from. Such conditions could be controlled. If that man was born in Africa, he would just be probably lying in some street somewhere in some house doing nothing. And it would have robbed the world of one of the greatest minds of the 20th century and his discourse on black holes and time itself. See, the untapped potential within this area is massive. And if more money is directed towards this area of healthcare, the human resource we could tap into is unimaginable. Unfortunately, these are marginalized and mistreated, isolated and ignored, and to the great detriment of African countries and adds to the poverty levels. The inability to adequately fund these sectors has dire consequences on the wealth creation capabilities of a nation. And in spite of the repeated calls for these sectors to be funded, these calls fall on deaf ears in most African countries. Why? The answer is going to be found in the other sectors we'll be covering, which is culture and religion. So next week we'll be picking it up and looking at the fourth major reason. Well, it will be in episode 4, so we're on the third major reason Africa is poor, which is geography. And I know many of you will be shocked how geography plays a role in the poverty of Africa. I will show you. Don't you miss that episode, because you'll be blown away. Take care.